the transformation of the Italian peninsula from a collection of fragmented states into a unified kingdom, and then into an empire that would stretch across 3 continents, represents one of the most fascinating yet tragic stories of modern European history. This is the tale of a nation born from romantic idealism, nurtured by dreams of ancient Roman glory, yet ultimately consumed by ambitions that far exceeded its capabilities. It is a story whispered in the desert winds of Libya, echoed in the mountains of Ethiopia, and finally silenced in the rubble of World War II. In the gentle twilight of the 19th century, as the great powers of Europe carved up the world among themselves, Italy emerged as the youngest member of this imperial club. Born not from centuries of gradual expansion like Britain or France, but from a sudden burst of nationalist fervor that swept across the peninsula like wildfire. The Italian Empire was never truly an empire in the traditional sense. It was a dream wrapped in the tricolor flag, a desperate attempt to reclaim a greatness that had been lost for over a millennium. The story begins not with conquest, but with unification. Not with the clash of armies in distant lands, but with the passionate speeches of revolutionaries in hidden meeting rooms across Italy. The Risorgimento, that great awakening of Italian consciousness, gave birth to a nation that would spend the next 80 years trying to prove itself worthy of its illustrious past. Yet from its very inception, this new Italy was haunted by contradictions that would ultimately prove fatal. Risorgimento and Unification, 1861, the birth of a dream. The morning of March 17, 1861, marked not just the proclamation of the Kingdom of Italy, but the beginning of a national obsession that would consume 3 generations of Italians. In the ornate chambers of the Palazzo Carignano in Turin, as Victor Emmanuel II was declared the first king of Italy, few could have imagined that this moment of supreme triumph would set in motion a chain of events leading to one of history's most spectacular imperial failures. Giuseppe Garibaldi, the Lion of Caprera, stood among the assembled dignitaries with his characteristic red shirt now exchanged for formal military dress. His weathered hands, which had wielded sabers in the defense of Rome and led the Thousand through Sicily, now applauded the birth of the nation he had fought so desperately to create. Yet behind his piercing blue eyes lay a flicker of uncertainty, a recognition that the real work was only beginning. The Italy that emerged from the revolutionary fervor of the Risorgimento was less a unified nation than a collection of regions bound together by little more than geography and aspiration. Count Camillo di Cavour, the mastermind of Italian unification, understood better than anyone the precarious nature of this newborn kingdom. From his office in Turin, surrounded by maps of Europe and diplomatic correspondence, he could see the enormous challenges that lay ahead. The new Italy controlled a peninsula that stretched nearly 1,000 kilometers from the Alps to Sicily, yet it remained one of Europe's poorest and most backward regions. The industrial north, with its emerging textile mills and nascent steel production, existed in a different century from the feudal south, where peasants still worked the land using methods unchanged since medieval times. The statistics were sobering for anyone who cared to examine them closely. Of Italy's 25 million inhabitants, fewer than 3% could read and write in standard Italian. The vast majority spoke regional dialects so distinct that a Neapolitan fisherman would find it nearly impossible to communicate with a Lombard farmer. The new kingdom's treasury was virtually empty, drained by the costs of unification wars and burdened with the debts of the former states. Italy's industrial production lagged decades behind that of Britain, France, or the German states, while its military forces, cobbled together from various regional armies, lacked modern equipment, training, and most critically, a unified sense of purpose. Yet none of these harsh realities could dampen the intoxicating dreams that filled the minds of Italy's new political elite. In the cafes of Turin and the salons of Milan, educated Italians spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the glorious destiny that awaited their reborn nation. They were, after all, the heirs of Rome, the descendants of Caesar and Augustus, Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. The very stones beneath their feet had once supported the greatest empire the world had ever known. Surely it was only a matter of time before Italy reclaimed its rightful place among the great powers of Europe. This romantic vision of Italy's imperial destiny was not merely the fantasy of poets and philosophers. It found its most concrete expression in the writings and speeches of the era's political leaders, who genuinely believed that Italy's ancient heritage provided both the right and the obligation to pursue imperial expansion. The concept of Italia Irredenta, unredeemed Italy, extended far beyond the Austrian-controlled territories of the northeast. In the minds of many Italian nationalists, it encompassed not just Trieste and the Trentino, but vast regions of the Mediterranean that had once acknowledged Roman rule. The newly appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, studying maps in his cramped Turin office, could trace with his finger the routes that Roman legions had once marched. Here was Carthage, where Roman discipline had triumphed over Hannibal's genius. There was Egypt, where Roman engineering had harnessed the Nile's floods. Beyond lay the shores of Asia Minor and the Levant, all once united under the Roman eagle. These were not merely historical curiosities to be admired from a distance. They were inheritance deeds waiting to be claimed by Rome's legitimate successors. The reality, however, was that Italy in 1861 possessed neither the economic resources nor the military capability to sustain such ambitions. The new kingdom's annual budget barely covered the costs of basic administration and debt service. The Italian army, while enthusiastic, numbered fewer than 200,000 men and lacked modern artillery, adequate supply systems, and experienced officer corps. The Italian navy, assembled from the fleets of various former states, consisted largely of obsolete wooden vessels that would have seemed antiquated even to Nelson's generation. More fundamentally, Italy lacked the industrial foundation that had enabled other European powers to project force across vast distances. Britain's empire rested on the solid foundation of Manchester's textile mills, Birmingham's metallurgy, and Sheffield's steel production. France's colonial ventures were supported by a sophisticated financial system and advanced manufacturing capabilities. Even small Belgium could maintain extensive African territories thanks to its advanced industrial economy and efficient administrative systems. Italy possessed none of these advantages. Its industrial sector was concentrated in a few northern cities and remained dependent on foreign investment and expertise. The great majority of Italians remained subsistence farmers, producing barely enough to feed themselves, let alone generate the agricultural surpluses that could support imperial ventures. The Italian government's attempts to raise revenue through taxation met fierce resistance from a population already struggling with poverty, while efforts to attract foreign investment were hampered by political instability and the lack of developed infrastructure. Yet these material constraints could not extinguish the passionate belief that Italy was destined for greatness. In the universities of Turin and Bologna, professors delivered lectures on Roman history with an intensity that suggested they were describing contemporary events rather than ancient achievements. Students memorized the names of Roman emperors and the dates of imperial conquests with the fervor of revolutionaries learning the details of future campaigns. The study of archaeology became almost a patriotic duty, as scholars sought to uncover physical evidence of Italy's glorious past that might inspire its equally glorious future. This romantic vision of imperial destiny found its most powerful expression in the works of contemporary Italian writers and intellectuals. Gaetano Carducci, who would later become Italy's first Nobel Prize winner in literature, composed stirring verses that explicitly linked modern Italy with ancient Rome. His poems spoke of eagles returning to their ancestral heights, of the Mediterranean reclaiming its Roman name of Mare Nostrum, RC. These were not merely literary exercises but political manifestos disguised as poetry, calls to action wrapped in classical allusions. The influence of such romantic nationalism extended far beyond intellectual circles. In the elementary schools that the new Italian state began establishing throughout the peninsula, children learned to recite patriotic poems that promised future glory while conveniently glossing over present difficulties. The standardized textbooks, written by northern educators who had never set foot in the rural South, presented a sanitized version of Italian history that emphasized heroic achievements while minimizing the complex realities of regional differences and social tensions. This educational program, while admirable in its attempt to create a unified national consciousness, had the unintended consequence of fostering unrealistic expectations about Italy's capabilities and destiny. Generations of Italian schoolchildren grew up believing that their country's temporary weakness was merely an accident of history, that Italy's rightful place was among the great imperial powers, and that this destiny could be achieved through will and determination alone. The new Italian parliament, meeting in the converted palace that had once housed the kings of Sardinia, regularly echoed these themes in its debates. Deputies from across the peninsula rose to deliver speeches that mixed practical politics with soaring rhetoric about Italy's imperial mission. Even the most mundane discussions about tax policy or railway construction were often framed in terms of preparing the nation for its inevitable return to great power status. King Victor Emmanuel II, despite his practical Piedmontese temperament, was not immune to these imperial dreams. In his private correspondence with European monarchs, he frequently alluded to Italy's special role in Mediterranean affairs and hinted at future expansion that would restore the balance of power in southern Europe. His court, still modest by the standards of Vienna or St. Petersburg, nonetheless began adopting the ceremonial trappings associated with imperial dignity. The contradiction between Italy's imperial ambitions and its actual capabilities became apparent almost immediately. The new kingdom's first major international crisis came not from imperial expansion but from the far more basic challenge of maintaining internal order. The so-called brigandage in southern Italy revealed the extent to which the new state remained more of a political abstraction than a functioning reality. Entire regions of the south remained under the de facto control of bandit groups that the Italian army proved incapable of suppressing despite years of costly military campaigns. These internal difficulties, however, did little to dampen imperial enthusiasm among Italy's political elite. If anything, they seemed to reinforce the belief that foreign adventures might provide the unity and purpose that domestic politics had failed to create. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Just as the wars of unification had forged a national consciousness among previously divided Italians, so imperial conquests might complete the process of nation-building by providing common enemies and shared glories. This line of thinking gained particular currency among the generation of Italian politicians who came of age in the 1870s and 1880s. Having missed the heroic period of unification, they sought their own opportunities for glory and national service. Many had studied in German universities, where they had absorbed the fashionable theories about national destiny and racial superiority that were sweeping through European intellectual circles. They returned to Italy convinced that their country's future lay not in patient economic development but in bold imperial ventures that would announce Italy's arrival among the great powers. 2. Eritrea first steps into empire, 1880s to 1890s. The gentle lapping of Red Sea waves against the ancient port of Massawa carried with it the dreams and delusions of a nation desperate to prove itself. In the sweltering heat of an African dawn in 1885, Italian soldiers in their crisp European uniforms stepped onto the sandy shores of what would become Eritrea, Italy's first colonial possession. They came not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as inheritors of a vision that had been gestating in the minds of Italian politicians for nearly a quarter century. The decision to establish an Italian presence on the Red Sea had emerged not from any grand strategic plan, but from a combination of opportunism, wounded national pride, and the persistent belief that Italy could not remain a great power without overseas territories. Francesco Crispi, the fiery Sicilian who had become Italy's most influential statesman, paced the marble floors of his Roman office, studying telegrams from the Red Sea with the intensity of a general planning a decisive battle. In his weathered hands, he held what he believed to be the key to Italy's imperial future. A foothold in Africa that would announce to the world that the new kingdom of Italy had arrived as a serious player in the imperial game. The opportunity had presented itself almost by accident. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 had transformed the Red Sea from a forgotten backwater into one of the world's most strategically important waterways. European powers suddenly discovered an urgent need for coaling stations and naval bases along the African coast. Britain had secured Aden, France had established itself in Djibouti, and even small Belgium was eyeing potential acquisitions. Italy, still struggling with the basic challenges of national consolidation, watched these developments with growing alarm and envy. The proximate cause of Italian involvement came through the Rubitino Shipping Company, a Genoese firm that had purchased the small port of Assab from local chiefs in 1869. For more than a decade, this transaction remained little more than a commercial curiosity, generating modest profits from the salt trade and serving as a minor way station for vessels bound for India. But as European colonial fever intensified in the early 1880s, Italian politicians began to see Assab as something far more significant. the nucleus of a future empire. The transformation of a modest commercial outpost into the foundation of Italian colonial empire required a fundamental shift in how Italy's leaders understood their nation's place in the world. The generation of politicians who had achieved unification through careful diplomacy and limited warfare now gave way to a new cohort who believed that Italy's survival as a great power depended on imperial expansion. They looked with envy at the vast territories controlled by Britain and France, the growing German presence in Africa, and even the modest but profitable colonies maintained by Portugal and Belgium. The Italian acquisition of Eritrea began in earnest in 1885, when the government formally assumed control of the Rubitino Company's assets and declared its intention to establish a permanent presence in the region. The initial Italian force consisted of fewer than 2,000 soldiers, most of them recent recruits who had never left Italy before, let alone experienced the brutal heat and alien landscape of the Horn of Africa. They were commanded by officers who had learned their trade in the relatively genteel warfare of Italian unification, men accustomed to fighting fellow Europeans according to recognized rules of engagement. The reality they encountered in Eritrea challenged every assumption they had brought with them from Europe. The local population consisted of diverse ethnic groups, Tigrinya-speaking Christians in the highlands, Afar nomads in the desert lowlands, and Beja pastoralists along the coast, each with their own complex political structures, religious traditions, and attitudes toward foreign intervention. Some local leaders, particularly those engaged in trade, welcomed the Italian presence as a source of protection and commercial opportunity. Others viewed the Europeans as simply the latest in a long series of would-be conquerors who would eventually be absorbed or expelled like all the others. General Oreste Baratieri, appointed as the first Italian governor of Eritrea, established his headquarters in Massawa with grand ambitions that far exceeded his modest resources. A veteran of Garibaldi's campaigns and a devoted student of Roman history, Baratieri genuinely believed that he was following in the footsteps of ancient Roman proconsuls who had extended civilization to the barbarian periphery. His correspondence with Rome was filled with confident predictions about the wealth that would flow from Italian enterprise in Africa and the strategic advantages that would accrue from controlling key positions along the Red Sea trade routes. The initial phase of Italian colonization focused on securing the coastal plain and establishing basic infrastructure that could support a permanent European presence. Italian engineers, many of them recent graduates from the technical schools of northern Italy, arrived with detailed plans for harbors, roads, and telegraph lines that would connect Eritrea to the wider world. They worked in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, battling not only the relentless heat and periodic sandstorms, but also tropical diseases for which their European medical training had provided no preparation. The construction of infrastructure in Eritrea became both a practical necessity and a symbolic statement of Italian intentions. The expansion of Massawa's port facilities required moving thousands of tons of Italian stone and steel across thousands of miles of ocean, a logistical challenge that strained the resources of the Italian Navy and merchant marine. Yet Italian officials insisted on using European materials and European techniques, partly from genuine belief in their superiority, but also from a desire to create visible monuments to Italian engineering prowess. The most ambitious project undertaken during these early years was the construction of a railway line connecting Massawa to the highland city of Asmara. This 117-kilometer line, climbing nearly 2,400 meters through some of the most challenging terrain in Africa, represented an extraordinary feat of engineering that pushed Italian technical capabilities to their limits. The project required the construction of dozens of bridges and viaducts, the excavation of numerous tunnels through solid rock, and the transport of locomotives and rolling stock upgrades that exceeded anything attempted in European railway construction. Italian engineers approached this challenge with characteristic enthusiasm and insufficient preparation. They had studied the construction techniques used in building railways through the Alps, but the geological conditions they encountered in Eritrea differed dramatically from anything they had experienced in Europe. The volcanic rock of the Eritrean highlands proved alternately too hard to excavate efficiently and too unstable to support heavy construction. Seasonal rainfall patterns, which local inhabitants understood intuitively, repeatedly surprised Italian planners who had relied on European meteorological models. The human cost of these infrastructure projects was enormous, though Italian colonial administrators preferred not to dwell on such details in their reports to Rome. Thousands of local workers, recruited through traditional chiefs and paid minimal wages, labored in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable for European workers. Italian overseers, driven by pressure to complete projects on schedule and within budget, often pushed their workforce beyond the limits of endurance. Disease, accidents, and exhaustion claimed hundreds of lives, though exact figures were never systematically recorded. Yet despite these difficulties, the Massawa-Asmara Railway gradually took shape, creating the first modern transportation link between the coast and the interior of what would become Eritrea. The completion of each section was celebrated in Italy as evidence of national technological prowess and imperial destiny. Italian newspapers published detailed descriptions of the engineering challenges overcome and the strategic advantages gained, while carefully avoiding mention of the human cost or the enormous financial burden the project placed on the Italian treasury. The establishment of Italian rule in Eritrea required more than just infrastructure development. It demanded the creation of entirely new systems of administration, law, and social control. Italian colonial officials, most of whom had no previous experience with non-European societies, struggled to understand the complex ethnic and religious divisions that characterized the region. Their initial attempts to impose European-style administrative structures often conflicted with traditional patterns of authority and created resentment among local populations who saw their customary practices dismissed as primitive or irrelevant. The Italian approach to colonial governance in Eritrea reflected the broader contradictions in Italian colonial policy. On one hand, officials in Rome proclaimed their intention to bring civilization and progress to Africa, following models established by more experienced colonial powers. On the other hand, Italy lacked both the resources and the experience necessary to implement such ambitious programs effectively. Italian colonial administrators found themselves caught between unrealistic expectations from Rome and practical limitations imposed by local conditions. The most serious challenge to Italian rule in Eritrea came not from organized resistance movements, but from the gradual realization that the colony would never generate the wealth that had been promised to justify its acquisition. Early Italian surveys had identified potential mineral resources and agricultural opportunities that seemed to offer prospects for profitable development. Italian geologists reported the presence of gold, copper, and other valuable materials, while agricultural experts predicted that European farming techniques could transform the highlands into productive agricultural regions. These optimistic assessments proved largely illusory. The mineral deposits, while real, were generally too small or too difficult to extract profitably with available technology. The agricultural experiments, conducted by Italian experts who had little understanding of local climate and soil conditions, produced disappointing results that fell far short of expectations. The hoped-for profits from trade proved modest at best, as Italian merchants found themselves competing with more experienced Arab and Indian traders who had established relationships in the region over generations. By the early 1890s, it had become clear that Eritrea would remain a financial burden rather than a source of wealth for the Italian treasury. Yet Italian politicians found it impossible to abandon their first colonial venture without losing face before their European rivals. The solution they adopted was to double down on imperial expansion, arguing that Eritrea's economic potential could only be realized within the context of a larger East African empire that would include the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia. This fateful decision to expand beyond the modest confines of Eritrea would ultimately lead to one of the most humiliating defeats in colonial history. But in the optimistic atmosphere of the 1890s, Italian colonial enthusiasts convinced themselves that success was simply a matter of applying sufficient will and resources to overcome temporary obstacles. The dream of empire, born in the romantic nationalism of the Risorgimento, was about to encounter the harsh realities of African resistance and Italian limitations. The legacy of Italy's early experience in Eritrea would haunt Italian colonial policy for the next half-century. The gap between imperial ambitions and practical capabilities, first evident in the difficult construction of the Massawa-Asmara Railway, would become a defining characteristic of Italian imperialism. Yet the railway itself, winding its way through the dramatic landscape of the Eritrean highlands, stood as a monument to Italian determination and engineering skill, a tangible symbol of a nation's desperate desire to prove itself worthy of greatness. In the quiet of an Eritrean evening, as the Red Sea breeze carried the scent of acacia and the distant sound of traditional music, Italian soldiers stationed in remote outposts could sometimes glimpse the magnitude of what their nation had undertaken. They were participants in an experiment that would test whether a young European nation, born from romantic idealism rather than gradual historical development, could successfully transform itself into an imperial power. The answer to that question would be written in the sand and stone of Africa, in the triumphs and disasters that still lay ahead. 3. Libya. The Desert Dream, 1911 to 1912. The autumn sun of 1911 cast long shadows across the ancient ruins of Leptis Magna as Italian naval officers surveyed the Libyan coastline through their binoculars, seeing not the crumbling stones of Roman grandeur, but the foundation of Italy's second colonial venture. The decision to invade Ottoman-controlled Libya represented a dramatic escalation in Italian imperial ambitions, transforming what had been a cautious experiment in Eritrea into a bold declaration that Italy intended to claim its place among the great colonial powers of Europe. Giovanni Giolitti, Italy's pragmatic prime minister, stood in his Roman study surrounded by maps of North Africa, telegraph cables from European capitals, and reports from Italian intelligence agents who had been quietly surveying Ottoman defenses for months. Unlike the opportunistic acquisition of Eritrea, the Libyan venture was conceived as Italy's first deliberately planned imperial conquest, a calculated gamble that would either establish Italy as a serious colonial power or expose the fundamental weakness that still plagued the 40-year-old kingdom. The strategic logic behind the Libyan invasion seemed compelling to Italian planners who had studied the colonial successes of their European neighbors. Libya's position on the southern shore of the Mediterranean placed it directly opposite Sicily and southern Italy, making it a natural extension of Italian territory rather than a distant colonial possession. The provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica contained nearly 680,000 square miles of territory, an area larger than France and Germany combined, offering seemingly limitless opportunities for Italian settlement and economic development. More importantly, Libya represented Italy's last realistic opportunity to acquire a substantial colonial territory without directly challenging the established spheres of influence of Britain, France, or Germany. The Ottoman Empire, increasingly weakened by internal strife and external pressures, appeared unable to defend its North African possessions effectively. French occupation of Tunisia in 1881 and British control of Egypt had already demonstrated Ottoman vulnerability in the region, while the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 had created additional instability that Italian planners hoped to exploit. The Italian military preparations for the Libyan campaign reflected the lessons learned from earlier colonial failures, while revealing persistent weaknesses in Italian planning and logistics. General Carlo Caneva, appointed as commander of the expeditionary force, assembled an invasion fleet of 34,000 troops, supported by a naval squadron that represented the largest military operation undertaken by Italy since unification. Unlike the small, improvised forces that had occupied Eritrea, this was intended to be a proper imperial conquest that would demonstrate Italian military competence to skeptical European observers. The soldiers who boarded Italian transports in the ports of Naples, Genoa, and Brindisi during September 1911 represented a new generation of Italian military personnel, many of whom had been born after unification and raised on stories of imperial destiny. They carried modern rifles, wore uniforms designed specifically for desert warfare, and had received training in the tactics that Italian officers believed would be necessary for fighting in North African conditions. Their equipment included motor vehicles, wireless telegraph sets, and other technological innovations that their predecessors in Eritrea had lacked. Yet beneath this surface of military modernization lay the familiar problems that had plagued Italian colonial ventures from the beginning. The Italian army's logistics system, adequate for operations within the Italian peninsula, proved poorly adapted to the challenges of projecting force across the Mediterranean and maintaining supply lines in hostile territory. The officer corps, while professionally trained and personally brave, had little experience with large-scale operations or the complex coordination required for modern warfare. The initial Italian landings along the Libyan coast on October 3, 1911, proceeded more smoothly than Italian planners had dared hope. Ottoman forces in the region numbered fewer than 8,000 men, many of them local recruits with minimal training and obsolete equipment. The coastal cities of Tripoli, Benghazi, Derna, and Tobruk fell to Italian forces within weeks, often after only token resistance from Ottoman garrisons that were outnumbered and outgunned by the Italian Expeditionary Force. Italian war correspondents, accompanying the invasion force with official approval, filed enthusiastic reports that portrayed the conquest of Libya as a masterpiece of military planning and execution. Their dispatches, published in newspapers throughout Italy, described cheering crowds of Arab civilians welcoming Italian soldiers as liberators from Ottoman oppression, while Italian engineers immediately began work on harbor improvements, road construction, and other infrastructure projects that would transform Libya into a model colony. The reality on the ground was considerably more complex than these optimistic newspaper accounts suggested. While some urban merchants and tribal leaders did initially welcome the Italians as potential allies against Ottoman rule, the majority of the population remained suspicious of all foreign occupiers. The Italian promise to respect local customs and religious practices met widespread skepticism from Arab and Berber communities that had experienced centuries of foreign domination without ever experiencing the benefits that invaders invariably promised. General Caneva, establishing his headquarters in the Ottoman governor's former palace in Tripoli, found himself facing challenges that Italian military planning had not adequately anticipated. The swift conquest of the coastal cities had given Italy control of Libya's major ports and administrative centers, but the vast interior of the country remained largely unknown territory where Ottoman influence had always been minimal and Italian authority was non-existent. The first serious indication that the Libyan conquest would prove more difficult than anticipated came in the form of increasingly effective resistance from Arab and Turkish forces that had withdrawn into the interior. These groups, led by a combination of Ottoman officers and local tribal leaders, adopted guerrilla tactics that exploited their superior knowledge of local terrain and weather conditions. They avoided direct confrontation with Italian forces while launching hit-and-run attacks against isolated outposts and supply convoys. The most significant early setback for Italian forces occurred at the Battle of Sierra Sayat on October 23, 1911, when an Italian column was ambushed while conducting a reconnaissance mission near Tripoli. The attack, carried out by Arab fighters who appeared suddenly from hidden positions in the desert, resulted in over 500 Italian casualties and the loss of substantial quantities of equipment and supplies. The psychological impact of this defeat far exceeded its military significance, as it demonstrated that Italian forces were vulnerable to tactics they had not encountered in their European training. Italian military commanders responded to these guerrilla attacks with increasing severity, implementing policies of collective punishment and forced population movements that were intended to isolate resistance fighters from their sources of support. These harsh measures, while sometimes tactically effective in the short term, created lasting resentment among the civilian population and provided propaganda advantages to resistance leaders who portrayed the Italians as brutal occupiers rather than benevolent modernizers. The character of the Libyan resistance was shaped by the complex interaction between Turkish military advisors, local tribal leaders, and Islamic religious authorities who saw the Italian invasion as an attack on their faith as well as their territory. The most effective resistance leader to emerge during this period was Omar al-Mukhtar, a Senussi sheikh whose profound knowledge of desert warfare and ability to coordinate diverse tribal groups would make him a legendary figure in Libyan history and a persistent nightmare for Italian colonial administrators. Al-Mukhtar's guerrilla campaign against Italian forces demonstrated the fundamental mismatch between European military doctrine and the realities of desert warfare in North Africa. Italian officers, trained to fight conventional battles between organized armies, found themselves confronting an enemy that appeared and disappeared like desert mirages, striking when conditions were favorable and melting away when faced with superior force. The vast spaces of the Libyan interior, which Italian planners had seen as an opportunity for settlement and development, became a liability that stretched Italian forces beyond their capacity to maintain effective control. The Italian response to guerrilla warfare in Libya involved a combination of military innovation and brutal repression that would establish patterns followed in later colonial conflicts. Italian forces began experimenting with aircraft for reconnaissance and light bombing missions, making Libya one of the first theaters where military aviation was used in combat operations. These early aircraft, primitive by later standards but revolutionary for their time, provided Italian commanders with unprecedented ability to observe enemy movements and coordinate attacks across vast distances. The use of aircraft in Libya also marked the beginning of Italy's love affair with aviation technology, which would later play a crucial role in fascist propaganda and military doctrine. Italian pilots, many of them aristocratic adventurers seeking glory and advancement, became popular heroes whose exploits were celebrated in newspapers and popular literature. Their missions over the Libyan desert were portrayed as examples of Italian technological superiority and martial valor, helping to maintain public support for a colonial war that was proving far more expensive and difficult than originally anticipated. Despite these technological innovations, the fundamental problem of controlling Libya's vast interior remained unsolved. Italian forces could occupy the major oases and patrol the main caravan routes, but they lacked the manpower and resources necessary to establish permanent control over the entire territory. The resistance movement, supplied with weapons and advisors from the Ottoman Empire and later from other sources, maintained the ability to launch attacks against Italian positions and retreat to sanctuary areas beyond the reach of conventional military operations. The economic development of Libya, which had been central to Italian justification for the conquest, proved even more challenging than the military pacification of the territory. Italian colonial administrators had arrived with ambitious plans for agricultural colonies, mining operations, and commercial enterprises that would transform Libya into a profitable addition to the Italian Empire. These plans were based on optimistic assessments of Libya's natural resources and agricultural potential that bore little resemblance to the harsh realities of desert conditions. Italian agricultural experts, many of whom had successful experience with land reclamation projects in southern Italy, discovered that Libyan conditions required entirely different approaches to farming and water management. The seasonal patterns of rainfall that made agriculture possible in certain regions of Libya followed cycles that differed dramatically from European or even Eritrean patterns. The soil composition, water table depth, and climate variations all presented challenges that required years of experimentation and substantial capital investment to overcome. The search for mineral wealth in Libya yielded similarly disappointing results during the early years of Italian occupation. Geological surveys had identified potential oil deposits and other valuable resources, but the technology and capital required to exploit these resources on a commercial scale exceeded Italian capabilities. The immediate costs of military occupation and administration far exceeded any revenues generated by economic development, making Libya a substantial drain on the Italian treasury rather than the profitable venture that had been promised. The Italian attempt to attract settlers to Libya met with mixed success that reflected broader problems with Italian colonial policy. The government offered subsidized transportation, free land grants, and other incentives to encourage emigration from overcrowded regions of southern Italy and Sicily. Some Italian families did establish successful farms and businesses in Libya, particularly in the coastal regions where climate and soil conditions were more favorable for European-style agriculture. However, the majority of potential Italian emigrants preferred to seek opportunities in the Americas rather than face the uncertainties and dangers of life in a contested colonial territory. The persistent guerrilla warfare, harsh climate, and cultural isolation of Libya made it an unattractive destination for Italian families seeking better economic opportunities. Those who did emigrate to Libya often found themselves concentrated in heavily fortified settlements that resembled military camps more than civilian communities. The diplomatic consequences of the Libyan War extended far beyond the immediate conflict between Italy and the Ottoman Empire. European powers watched Italian military performance with considerable interest, drawing conclusions about Italian capabilities that would influence their calculations during the approaching World War. The relative ease with which Italy had conquered the coastal cities impressed some observers, while the persistence of guerrilla resistance raised questions about Italian staying power and administrative competence. The war also demonstrated the increasingly interconnected nature of Mediterranean and European politics in the early 20th century. The Italian attack on Ottoman territory contributed to the chain of crises that would culminate in the Balkan Wars and ultimately in the global conflict of 1914 to 1918. Italian success in Libya encouraged Balkan states to challenge Ottoman control in Europe, while the Ottoman Empire's difficulties in defending its African territories revealed weaknesses that encouraged further aggression from multiple directions. By the time Italy formally annexed Libya through the Treaty of Ouchy in October 1912, the initial enthusiasm for colonial conquest had been tempered by the reality of governing a vast, hostile territory with limited resources and persistent resistance. The Italian flag flew over the major coastal cities and administrative centers, but effective Italian control extended only a few miles inland from these fortified positions. The dream of transforming Libya into a showcase of Italian civilization and a source of national wealth remained largely unrealized. The pattern established in Libya would haunt Italian colonial policy for the next 3 decades. The gap between imperial ambitions and practical capabilities, first evident in Eritrea, had become even more pronounced in the vastly larger territory of Libya. Italian forces possessed sufficient strength to conquer coastal positions and defeat Ottoman regular forces in conventional battles, but they lacked the resources and expertise necessary to establish effective control over the interior or to defeat a determined guerrilla resistance movement. Yet the conquest of Libya represented a significant psychological victory for Italian nationalism and provided crucial experience that would shape Italian military doctrine and colonial policy in the years to come. Italian officers who served in Libya gained their first experience with modern warfare, desert conditions, and the challenges of governing non-European populations. These lessons, both positive and negative, would influence Italian performance in subsequent conflicts and colonial ventures. The economic burden of the Libyan War also had important consequences for Italian domestic politics and foreign policy. The substantial costs of the military campaign and subsequent occupation strained the Italian budget at a time when the country was still struggling with the basic challenges of national development. The financial pressures created by colonial commitments would contribute to Italy's decision to remain neutral during the early stages of World War I and would influence Italian strategic calculations throughout the interwar period. Most significantly, the Libyan conquest established a precedent for Italian imperial expansion that would ultimately lead to even more ambitious and disastrous ventures. The partial success in Libya convinced Italian leaders that their country possessed the military capabilities and imperial destiny necessary for further colonial expansion. This confidence would prove tragically misplaced when Italy attempted to conquer Ethiopia 2 decades later, but in 1912, the annexation of Libya seemed to confirm that Italy had successfully joined the ranks of European colonial powers. In the quiet of a Libyan evening, as the Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of olive groves and the distant sound of evening prayers, Italian soldiers stationed in their fortified compounds could sometimes sense the magnitude of what their nation had undertaken. They were participants in an experiment that would test whether European colonial methods, developed in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, could be successfully applied to the complex societies of the Arab world. The answer to that question would be written in the sand of the Sahara, in the decades of conflict and resistance that still lay ahead. 4. Ethiopia, Imperial Apotheosis, 1935 to 1936. The autumn mist of 1935 hung low over the Ethiopian highlands like a shroud concealing the greatest gamble in Italian imperial history. In the palaces of Rome, Benito Mussolini stood before an enormous map of East Africa, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark eyes fixed on the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia, the last unconquered prize in Africa, the symbol of European colonial failure, and what he believed would become the crown jewel of a new Italian empire that would rival the greatness of ancient Rome. Mussolini represented a fundamentally different kind of imperial leader from the cautious liberals who had guided Italy's earlier colonial ventures. Where Giolitti had been pragmatic and Crispi opportunistic, Illinois Duce was a true believer in the mythology of Italian imperial destiny. He possessed an intuitive understanding of how colonial conquest could serve domestic political purposes, transforming the frustrations and humiliations of ordinary Italians into pride and national purpose. The conquest of Ethiopia was conceived not merely as territorial expansion, but as the defining moment when Italy would finally claim its rightful place among the great powers of the world. The decision to invade Ethiopia emerged from a complex web of factors that had been building throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. The global economic depression had hit Italy particularly hard, creating massive unemployment and social unrest that threatened the stability of the fascist regime. Mussolini understood that foreign adventure could provide the unity and sense of purpose that domestic policies had failed to create. Moreover, the League of Nations' weakness in responding to Japanese aggression in Manchuria suggested that international opposition to Italian expansion might be limited to symbolic protests. The specific choice of Ethiopia as Italy's target reflected both practical considerations and powerful symbolic attractions. Ethiopia was one of only 2 independent nations remaining in Africa, a fact that represented a standing challenge to European colonial dominance and a potential source of inspiration for anti-colonial movements throughout the continent. More personally for Italy, Ethiopia was the site of the humiliating defeat at Adwa in 1896, where Ethiopian forces had inflicted one of the most devastating defeats ever suffered by a European colonial army. The memory of Adwa haunted Italian national consciousness for nearly 4 decades, serving as a constant reminder of Italy's failure to achieve the imperial success that seemed to come so easily to other European powers. Italian history textbooks treated the battle as a temporary setback caused by incompetent leadership and inadequate preparation, while fascist propaganda portrayed the eventual conquest of Ethiopia as a sacred duty to the memory of Italian soldiers who had died in Africa. The opportunity to erase this historical humiliation provided powerful motivation for a generation of Italian officers who had grown up hearing stories of the disaster. Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian emperor who would become the central figure opposing Italian expansion, represented everything that European colonial powers found most threatening about independent African leadership. Educated, articulate, and internationally connected, he had spent years modernizing Ethiopia's military forces and diplomatic capabilities, while maintaining the country's independence through careful balance between competing European interests. His court in Addis Ababa had become a symbol of African dignity and self-determination that challenged the racial assumptions underlying European colonialism. The Italian military preparations for the Ethiopian campaign dwarfed anything previously attempted by Italian forces in colonial warfare. General Emilio de Bono, appointed as commander of the Northern Front, assembled an invasion force of over 400,000 men, supported by modern aircraft, tanks, and artillery that represented the largest military operation in Italian history. Unlike the improvised expeditionary forces that had conquered Eritrea and Libya, this was intended to be a demonstration of modern military might that would settle the Ethiopian question permanently and decisively. The logistics of transporting and supplying such a massive force in the remote regions of East Africa presented unprecedented challenges for Italian military planners. Every rifle, every artillery shell, every gallon of fuel had to be shipped from Italy to Red Sea ports and then transported inland over primitive roads that often became impassable during the rainy season. The construction of adequate supply lines required the employment of tens of thousands of Eritrean and Italian laborers working under conditions that claimed hundreds of lives from disease, accidents, and exhaustion. The international context surrounding the Ethiopian invasion reflected the increasingly unstable balance of power in 1930s Europe. Britain and France, the traditional guardians of the League of Nations system, found themselves caught between their commitment to collective security and their desire to maintain Italian friendship against the growing threat of Nazi Germany. The resulting ambivalence in European diplomatic responses would prove crucial in determining the success of Italian aggression and the ultimate fate of the League of Nations as an effective peacekeeping organization. The Italian invasion began on October 3, 1935, with coordinated attacks from Eritrea in the north and Italian Somaliland in the south. The initial Italian advances proceeded more rapidly than even optimistic Italian planners had anticipated, as Ethiopian forces proved unable to withstand the concentrated firepower of modern European military equipment. Italian aircraft dominated the skies, providing close support for ground forces while conducting strategic bombing missions against Ethiopian cities and military installations. General Pietro Badoglio, who replaced de Bono as commander of Italian forces in late 1935, brought to the Ethiopian campaign a ruthless efficiency that reflected decades of experience in colonial warfare. Unlike his predecessor, who had attempted to conduct the conquest according to conventional European military ethics, Badoglio understood that success required the systematic use of terror against both military forces and civilian populations. His strategy involved not merely defeating Ethiopian armies in battle, but destroying the social and economic foundations that supported Ethiopian resistance. The most controversial aspect of the Italian campaign was the systematic use of poison gas against Ethiopian forces and civilian populations. Italian aircraft dropped mustard gas on Ethiopian troop concentrations, refugee columns, and even hospitals clearly marked with Red Cross symbols. This use of chemical weapons violated international law and represented a significant escalation in the brutality of colonial warfare, yet it proved devastatingly effective in breaking Ethiopian morale and military cohesion. The gas attacks created scenes of unimaginable horror across the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopian soldiers, lacking any protection against chemical weapons, died in agony as mustard gas burned their lungs and skin. Civilian populations fled their villages in panic, only to be caught in the open by Italian aircraft that continued the gas bombardment far from any military targets. The International Red Cross estimated that Italian chemical weapons caused over 100,000 casualties, though exact figures remain impossible to determine due to the chaos that accompanied the Italian advance. Haile Selassie's attempts to rally international support for Ethiopian resistance met with diplomatic expressions of concern but little concrete assistance. His famous address to the League of Nations in Geneva on June 30, 1936, delivered in fluent French to an assembly that included representatives of the world's major powers, represented one of the most eloquent appeals for collective security ever heard in an international forum. Yet his warnings about the consequences of allowing aggression to succeed went largely unheeded by nations more concerned with their immediate strategic interests than with abstract principles of international law. The Emperor's speech to the League marked a turning point in the understanding of how European colonialism was perceived by its victims and by the broader international community. For the first time, an African leader had the opportunity to address the world's major powers as an equal, presenting evidence of war crimes and demanding justice in terms that European audiences could not easily dismiss or ignore. The dignity and moral authority that Haile Selassie displayed in Geneva contrasted sharply with the racist stereotypes that had traditionally been used to justify European domination of Africa. The military collapse of Ethiopian resistance came with shocking suddenness in early 1936. The Battle of Mechu on March 31, 1936, effectively ended organized Ethiopian resistance when Italian forces, supported by massive artillery bombardments and gas attacks, destroyed the last major Ethiopian army. Haile Selassie, recognizing that further resistance would only lead to greater suffering for his people, made the agonizing decision to abandon his capital and seek exile in Britain. The Italian entry into Addis Ababa on May 5, 1936, was orchestrated as a moment of supreme triumph that would demonstrate to the world Italy's emergence as a true imperial power. Badoglio's forces, marching through the dusty streets of the Ethiopian capital while Italian photographers and newsreel cameramen recorded every moment, represented the culmination of 4 decades of Italian colonial ambition. The scenes of victory were immediately transmitted back to Italy, where they were used to justify the enormous costs of the campaign and to generate popular enthusiasm for further imperial expansion. Mussolini's proclamation of the Italian Empire from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia on May 9, 1936, marked the high point of Italian imperial achievement and the moment when fascist rhetoric about restored Roman greatness seemed closest to reality. Speaking to a crowd of hundreds of thousands gathered in the piazza below, Illinois Duce announced the creation of Italian East Africa, a vast colonial federation that would encompass Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland under unified Italian administration. The new empire that emerged from the Ethiopian conquest encompassed over 1.2 million square kilometers and included approximately 12 million inhabitants, making it one of the largest colonial territories in Africa. Italian colonial administrators, many of whom had gained experience in Libya and Eritrea, arrived with ambitious plans for economic development, infrastructure construction, and the establishment of settler colonies that would demonstrate the benefits of Italian rule to both European and African observers. The administrative structure of Italian East Africa reflected the fascist regime's belief in hierarchical organization and centralized control. The territory was divided into 6 governorates, each administered by Italian officials appointed directly from Rome and responsible for implementing policies designed to transform the region into a profitable and strategically valuable addition to the Italian Empire. The new colonial bureaucracy included specialists in agriculture, mining, transportation, and education who were tasked with creating a modern colonial state from the remnants of Ethiopian independence. The economic development plans for Italian East Africa were extraordinarily ambitious, envisioning the transformation of the region into a major source of agricultural products, mineral wealth, and manufactured goods that would reduce Italy's dependence on imports from other colonial powers. Italian engineers designed massive irrigation projects that would bring modern farming techniques to the Ethiopian highlands, while geologists conducted surveys aimed at identifying mineral deposits that could be exploited using Italian technology and capital. The reality of governing Italian East Africa proved far more complex than these optimistic plans suggested. The Ethiopian population, while militarily defeated, remained largely hostile to Italian rule and resistant to attempts at cultural assimilation. The country's complex ethnic and religious divisions, which had been held together by the personal authority of Haile Selassie and traditional political structures, created ongoing challenges for Italian administrators who lacked understanding of local customs and languages. The Italian attempt to establish settler colonies in Ethiopia met with mixed results that reflected broader problems with fascist colonial policy. The government offered generous incentives to encourage Italian families to emigrate to East Africa, including free transportation, land grants, and guaranteed employment in colonial administration or development projects. Some Italian settlers did establish successful farms and businesses, particularly in the temperate highlands around Addis Ababa, where climate conditions were suitable for European-style agriculture and settlement. However, the majority of Italian emigrants continued to prefer destinations in the Americas or other parts of Europe rather than face the uncertainties of life in a recently conquered territory where guerrilla resistance continued to pose ongoing security threats. Those Italians who did settle in Ethiopia often found themselves isolated in fortified compounds that provided security but limited opportunities for the kind of normal civilian life that colonial propaganda had promised. The racial policies implemented in Italian East Africa reflected the increasingly radical direction of fascist ideology during the late 1930s. New laws prohibited marriage between Italians and Africans, established separate educational systems for different racial groups, and created legal frameworks that institutionalized discrimination in employment, housing, and civil rights. These policies, influenced by Nazi racial theories and designed to maintain clear distinctions between rulers and ruled, created resentment among educated Africans who had initially hoped that Italian rule might provide opportunities for advancement and modernization. The international consequences of the Ethiopian conquest extended far beyond Africa, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Europe and contributing to the diplomatic isolation that would eventually drive Italy into alliance with Nazi Germany. The League of Nations' imposition of economic sanctions against Italy, while ultimately ineffective in preventing the conquest, demonstrated the growing polarization between fascist and democratic powers that would culminate in World War II. The economic sanctions imposed by League members created serious difficulties for the Italian economy, but also provided Mussolini with powerful propaganda tools for mobilizing domestic support. The regime portrayed the sanctions as evidence of British and French jealousy of Italian achievements, and as an attack on Italy's legitimate right to imperial expansion. The famous Day of Faith on December 18, 1935, when Italian women donated their gold wedding rings to support the war effort, became a symbol of national unity and sacrifice that strengthened popular support for the regime. The technological innovations employed during the Ethiopian campaign had important implications for the development of modern warfare. Italian experiments with combined arms tactics, close air support, and mechanized logistics provided valuable experience that would influence military doctrine throughout Europe. The use of aircraft for both tactical and strategic missions demonstrated the growing importance of air power in modern warfare, while the systematic employment of chemical weapons established precedents that would be remembered during World War II. The propaganda value of the Ethiopian conquest for the fascist regime cannot be overstated. The victory provided concrete evidence that Mussolini's promises of restored Italian greatness were being fulfilled, while the dramatic scenes of modern Italian armies conquering ancient African kingdoms satisfied deep psychological needs for national validation and imperial prestige. Italian newsreels, newspapers, and radio broadcasts celebrated the conquest as proof that fascism represented a superior form of political organization capable of achieving results that democratic governments could not match. Yet beneath the surface of imperial triumph lay the familiar problems that had plagued Italian colonial ventures from the beginning. The enormous costs of the Ethiopian campaign had strained Italian finances to the breaking point, while the ongoing requirements of governing and developing the new territory continued to drain resources that the Italian economy could ill afford. The gap between imperial ambitions and practical capabilities, evident in Eritrea and Libya, had become even more pronounced in the vastly larger and more complex territory of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian resistance movement, while militarily defeated, never entirely disappeared and continued to pose ongoing security challenges for Italian administrators throughout the brief period of Italian rule. Guerrilla fighters, often supplied with weapons hidden during the conquest, launched sporadic attacks against Italian military posts and infrastructure projects. These resistance activities, while unable to threaten Italian control seriously, required the maintenance of substantial military forces and created an atmosphere of constant tension that limited the effectiveness of development programs. The most serious challenge to Italian rule in Ethiopia came from the persistence of traditional political and religious structures that had provided the foundation for Ethiopian independence for over 2 millennia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with its network of monasteries and schools, maintained alternative sources of authority and identity that Italian colonial administrators found difficult to control or co-opt. Similarly, traditional chiefs and local officials often maintained their influence by accommodating Italian rule superficially while preserving their real authority through informal networks. The cultural impact of the Ethiopian conquest on Italian society was profound and lasting. The victory seemed to validate fascist claims about Italian racial superiority and imperial destiny, while providing a shared experience of national achievement that transcended regional and class divisions. Italian popular culture during the late 1930s was saturated with imperial themes, from movies and songs celebrating the conquest to children's books that presented colonialism as a noble civilizing mission. The architectural and artistic legacy of Italian rule in Ethiopia reflected the regime's belief in the power of monumental construction to demonstrate imperial permanence and cultural superiority. Italian architects designed new government buildings, churches, and residential districts in Addis Ababa that combined classical European styles with local materials and decorative elements. These structures, many of which survive today, represented attempts to create a distinctive imperial architecture that would symbolize the fusion of Italian and African cultures under fascist rule. The scientific and exploratory activities conducted during the Ethiopian campaign contributed to European knowledge of African geography, ethnography, and natural history. Italian scholars, accompanying the military forces, conducted systematic studies of Ethiopian languages, customs, and historical traditions that had previously been largely unknown to European academics. These research activities, while conducted within the framework of colonial domination, produced valuable documentation of African cultures and societies that continues to be useful for contemporary scholars. The medical challenges encountered during the Ethiopian campaign provided Italian doctors and researchers with important experience in tropical medicine and public health that would prove valuable in subsequent colonial and military operations. The high rates of disease among Italian forces operating in unfamiliar African environments led to innovations in preventive medicine, sanitation, and medical logistics that advanced Italian medical capabilities more generally. By the time Italian East Africa was formally established as a unified colonial federation in 1936, the fundamental contradictions that would ultimately doom the Italian Empire were already becoming apparent. The enormous costs of conquest and administration far exceeded any economic benefits that could be generated from the territory, while the international isolation caused by the conquest weakened Italy's position in European affairs at a time when new threats were emerging from Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Ethiopian conquest represented the high water mark of Italian imperial achievement, the moment when 4 decades of colonial ambition seemed finally to have achieved concrete results worthy of a great power. Italian forces had succeeded where other European armies had failed, conquering a territory larger than Germany and France combined while demonstrating military capabilities that surprised even friendly observers. The creation of Italian East Africa appeared to confirm that Italy had successfully joined the ranks of major colonial powers and acquired the overseas empire that nationalists had dreamed of since unification. Yet this apparent triumph contained within it the seeds of the disasters that would follow. The enormous resources devoted to Ethiopian conquest and administration left Italy poorly prepared for the greater challenges that lay ahead, while the international isolation caused by the conquest pushed Italy inexorably toward alliance with Nazi Germany. The dream of empire, which had begun as an expression of Italian national aspirations, was about to become the instrument of national destruction. In the soft light of an Ethiopian dawn, as the ancient mountains emerged from morning mist like sleeping giants, Italian colonial administrators could sometimes glimpse the magnitude of what their nation had achieved and the terrible price that would ultimately be paid for this achievement. They were the temporary masters of one of Africa's oldest civilizations, presiding over an empire that existed more in imagination than in reality, governing a population that submitted to their authority without ever accepting their legitimacy. V. World War II and Catastrophe, 1940 to 1943. The summer heat of 1940 shimmered over the ancient Roman Forum as Benito Mussolini stood once again on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia, preparing to announce Italy's entry into World War II. Below him, a carefully orchestrated crowd chanted his name, but their enthusiasm could not mask the profound uncertainty that gripped the Italian nation. The empire that had seemed so magnificent just 4 years earlier was about to face its ultimate test, a test for which it was catastrophically unprepared. The decision to enter the war represented the culmination of Mussolini's imperial ambitions and the beginning of their complete destruction. Il Duce had watched Hitler's early victories in Poland and France with a mixture of admiration and envy, convinced that Germany's success would provide opportunities for Italian territorial expansion that might never come again. Yet his decision to join the Axis powers was based more on wishful thinking than realistic assessment of Italian capabilities. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, chief of the Italian General Staff, sat in his war room surrounded by reports that painted a devastating picture of Italian military preparedness. The army that had conquered Ethiopia with such apparent ease was revealed to be a hollow shell when measured against the standards required for modern European warfare. Italian industry, despite 2 decades of fascist promises about autarky and modernization, remained incapable of producing the weapons, ammunition, and equipment necessary for sustained military operations against first-class opponents. The statistics were sobering for anyone willing to examine them honestly. Italy possessed fewer than 1,700 aircraft, most of them obsolete designs that would prove no match for British Hurricanes and Spitfires. The Italian Navy, while impressive in Mediterranean contexts, lacked the fuel reserves, radar technology, and air cover necessary for effective operations against the Royal Navy. Most critically, Italian tanks were hopelessly outclassed by German and British designs, while Italian artillery dated largely from World War I and lacked the range and firepower of modern weapons systems. The Italian declaration of war on June 10, 1940, was timed to coincide with the expected collapse of French resistance, allowing Italy to claim a share of the spoils without bearing the costs of prolonged fighting. Mussolini famously told his son-in-law that he needed only a few thousand dead to secure Italy's place at the peace conference. This cynical calculation reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the conflict that was unfolding, as well as a tragic underestimation of the price that would ultimately be paid for imperial ambitions. The first indication that Italian military performance would fall far short of fascist expectations came in the invasion of southern France, launched on June 20, 1940, just days before the French armistice with Germany. Italian forces, attacking across the Alpine frontier with overwhelming numerical superiority, found themselves stopped cold by a handful of French mountain troops manning outdated fortifications. The attack, which Mussolini had expected to result in the rapid occupation of Nice and Corsica, instead produced embarrassing casualties and virtually no territorial gains. General Rodolfo Graziani, commanding Italian forces in North Africa, understood better than most the impossibility of the tasks being assigned to Italian military forces. From his headquarters in Libya, he could see British positions in Egypt that were better supplied, better equipped, and supported by naval and air forces that completely dominated the eastern Mediterranean. His repeated requests for modern tanks, adequate ammunition, and reliable supply lines were met with bureaucratic delays and unrealistic promises from Rome. The Italian offensive against Egypt, launched in September 1940, initially proceeded according to plan as Italian forces advanced slowly across the desert toward the British base at Mersa Matruh. Graziani's caution, criticized by Mussolini as evidence of cowardice, actually reflected a realistic understanding of Italian limitations and British capabilities. The Italian advance halted after penetrating only 60 miles into Egypt, establishing fortified positions that Italian commanders hoped would prove defensible against the inevitable British counterattack. The British response, codenamed Operation Compass, began on December 9, 1940, and demonstrated with shocking clarity the difference between Italian colonial warfare capabilities and the requirements of modern military operations. British forces, numbering fewer than 36,000 men but equipped with superior tanks, artillery, and air support, smashed through Italian defenses with an ease that surprised even British commanders. Within 2 months, the entire Italian position in Egypt and eastern Libya had collapsed, with over 130,000 Italian soldiers captured and vast quantities of equipment destroyed or abandoned. The disaster in North Africa was compounded almost simultaneously by an even more humiliating failure in Greece. Mussolini's decision to invade Greece from Albania on October 28, 1940, was motivated by jealousy of German successes and a desire to demonstrate Italian military prowess in a theater where Italy could operate independently. The invasion was launched with minimal preparation, inadequate supplies, and no realistic assessment of Greek defensive capabilities or the challenging terrain that Italian forces would encounter. General Sebastiano Visconti Prasca, commanding the Italian invasion force, had assured Mussolini that Greek resistance would collapse within days of the initial attack. Instead, Greek forces not only stopped the Italian advance but launched successful counterattacks that drove Italian forces back into Albania and threatened to collapse the entire Italian position in the Balkans. The spectacle of Italian forces retreating in disorder before a much smaller Greek army provided devastating propaganda victories for Britain while exposing the fundamental weakness of Italian military organization. The humiliation of the Greek campaign was made worse by its timing, occurring just as Italian forces in North Africa were suffering their own catastrophic defeats. Italian newspapers, which had spent years celebrating imperial victories and military prowess, found themselves attempting to explain away disasters that made a mockery of fascist claims about Italian strength and determination. The regime's propaganda apparatus, so effective in promoting imperial adventures, proved completely inadequate for managing the psychological impact of military failure. Marshal Badoglio, recognizing the impossibility of defending Italy's overextended imperial positions with inadequate resources, submitted his resignation in December 1940 rather than continue to implement policies he knew would lead to further disasters. His replacement, General Ugo Cavallero, proved more willing to accommodate Mussolini's unrealistic demands, but no more capable of overcoming the fundamental limitations that plagued Italian military performance. The arrival of German forces in North Africa and the Balkans during early 1941 temporarily stabilized Italian positions, but at the cost of reducing Italy to junior partner status in its own imperial territories. General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, operating from bases in Libya, demonstrated the kind of mobile warfare that Italian forces had proven incapable of conducting. Similarly, the German invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, launched to rescue Italian forces from their predicament, succeeded brilliantly but revealed Italian military incompetence to German observers who had previously maintained polite diplomatic fictions about Italian capabilities. The German rescue of Italian positions created a paradoxical situation where Italy maintained nominal control over its imperial territories while depending entirely on German military support for their defense. Italian colonial administrators in East Africa found themselves increasingly isolated as British forces, operating from bases in Kenya and Sudan, began systematic campaigns to eliminate Italian presence in the region. The complex logistics required to supply Italian forces in Ethiopia became impossible once British naval forces gained complete control of the Red Sea. The collapse of Italian East Africa began in January 1941 with British offensives from multiple directions that exploited Italian weaknesses in mobility, communications, and air support. Italian forces, numbering over 200,000 men but scattered across vast territories and lacking adequate coordination, proved unable to concentrate sufficient strength to stop British advances. The psychological impact of facing British forces supported by Ethiopian irregular troops was devastating for Italian morale, as it became clear that the population they had claimed to rule as a civilizing force remained fundamentally hostile to Italian presence. The Battle of Keren in March 1941 represented the last serious Italian attempt to maintain control in East Africa. Italian forces, fighting from prepared positions in mountainous terrain that favored defensive operations, initially inflicted heavy casualties on attacking British and Commonwealth forces. However, Italian ammunition shortages, communication failures, and the complete absence of air support ultimately doomed the defense. The fall of Keren opened the road to Asmara and effectively ended Italian resistance in Eritrea. The surrender of Italian forces in Ethiopia came with shocking rapidity once British forces broke through the mountain barriers that had protected the Central Highlands. Italian colonial administrators, many of whom had spent years building careers and lives in East Africa, found themselves facing the complete collapse of everything they had worked to create. The evacuation of Italian civilians from Addis Ababa occurred under conditions of barely controlled panic, as years of colonial rule ended in humiliating flight before advancing British forces. Haile Selassie's returned to Addis Ababa on May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after Italian forces had entered the city in triumph, provided a powerful symbol of the complete failure of Italian imperial ambitions in East Africa. The emperor's restoration, accomplished with British military support but representing genuine Ethiopian national aspirations, demonstrated that Italian rule had never succeeded in winning the loyalty or acceptance of the populations it claimed to govern. The loss of Italian East Africa eliminated at a stroke the most substantial achievement of Italian imperial expansion and reduced Italy's overseas empire to the contested territories of Libya and the isolated outposts that remained under German protection. The strategic consequences were enormous, as Italy lost not only valuable territory but also the prestige and international standing that imperial possessions were supposed to provide. More immediately, the disasters in East Africa freed substantial British forces for operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The Italian home front, which had initially supported the war with enthusiasm generated by years of imperial propaganda, began to experience the reality of modern warfare as British bombing campaigns targeted Italian cities and industrial centers. The RAF's attacks on Turin, Milan, and Genoa brought the war directly to Italian civilians who had expected their country's imperial adventures to provide glory and profit rather than destruction and sacrifice. The contrast between fascist promises and wartime reality became impossible to ignore as food shortages, fuel rationing, and casualty lists undermined popular support for the regime. The industrial cities of northern Italy, which had provided the limited manufacturing base for Italian imperial expansion, became primary targets for Allied bombing campaigns that systematically destroyed the infrastructure necessary for military production. The Fiat factories in Turin, which had produced trucks and aircraft for colonial campaigns, were reduced to rubble by repeated air attacks. Similarly, the naval shipyards of Genoa and La Spezia, essential for maintaining Italian positions in the Mediterranean, suffered devastating damage that ended any possibility of replacing losses in naval warfare. The psychological impact of Allied bombing on Italian civilian morale was enormous, as it became clear that Italy's imperial pretensions had made the country a target for military action that its defenses were completely inadequate to prevent. Italian air defense capabilities, never strong, proved entirely insufficient against mass Allied bombing raids. The sight of British and American aircraft operating over Italian cities with apparent impunity provided a daily reminder of Italian military weakness and the futility of continued resistance. The Italian campaign in the Soviet Union, launched as part of Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, provided another theater for Italian military humiliation. The Italian Eighth Army, committed to operations on the Don River front, lacked the equipment, training, and logistical support necessary for warfare in Russian conditions. Italian soldiers, many of whom had never experienced temperatures below freezing, were issued uniforms and equipment suitable for Mediterranean campaigns but completely inadequate for Russian winter warfare. The destruction of Italian forces on the Eastern Front during the Soviet winter offensive of 1942 to 1943 eliminated some of Italy's best remaining military units and further reduced the country's already limited capacity for effective resistance. The survivors of the Russian campaign returned to Italy with harrowing stories of military incompetence and unnecessary sacrifice that further undermined popular confidence in fascist leadership and imperial policies. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 marked the beginning of the end for both Italian resistance and the fascist regime. Italian forces on the island, theoretically numbering over 300,000 men, collapsed with shocking rapidity before Allied forces that had expected to face much stiffer resistance. The ease of the Allied conquest demonstrated that Italian military capabilities had deteriorated to the point where effective defense of Italian territory itself had become impossible. The fall of Sicily created a political crisis in Rome that had been building throughout the war as military disasters accumulated and popular support for the regime evaporated. Mussolini, who had built his political career on promises of imperial glory and national greatness, found himself presiding over the complete collapse of Italian power and prestige. His removal from office on July 25, 1943, by a coalition of fascist leaders and monarchy supporters represented the ultimate repudiation of the imperial dreams that had sustained Italian foreign policy for over 60 years. The new government under Marshal Badoglio faced the impossible task of extricating Italy from a war that had already destroyed the country's imperial possessions and was threatening the existence of the Italian state itself. The secret negotiations for Italian surrender, conducted while German forces remained on Italian territory and Hitler, prepared to defend every inch of Italian soil, took place against the backdrop of complete imperial collapse and national humiliation. The German occupation of northern and central Italy following the announcement of Italian surrender on September 8, 1943, completed the destruction of Italian sovereignty and independence that had begun with the decision to enter the war. Italian forces, caught between German attempts to disarm them and Allied demands for active resistance, largely disintegrated as coherent military units. Many Italian soldiers simply abandoned their units and attempted to return home, while others were captured by German forces and transported to labor camps in Germany. The brief existence of the Italian Social Republic under German protection in northern Italy provided a tragic epilogue to the imperial dreams that had animated Italian foreign policy since unification. Mussolini, restored to nominal power by German bayonets, presided over a puppet state that controlled no overseas territories and depended entirely on German support for its continued existence. The grandiose imperial rhetoric that had once filled fascist speeches was replaced by desperate appeals for national survival and resistance to Allied occupation. The Italian resistance movement that emerged during the German occupation drew much of its motivation from revulsion against the imperial adventures that had brought such disaster to the Italian people. Partisans operating in the mountains of northern Italy fought not only against German occupation but against the entire legacy of fascist imperialism that had led Italy into catastrophic warfare. Their struggle represented a fundamental rejection of the imperial dreams that had dominated Italian politics for over half a century. The liberation of Rome on June 4, 1944, by Allied forces symbolically ended the Italian Empire that had been proclaimed from the same city just 8 years earlier. The imperial symbols and monuments that had celebrated Italian colonial achievements were quietly removed or reinterpreted, while Italian political leaders struggled to create new national narratives that could provide meaning and purpose for a country stripped of its imperial pretensions. The final liquidation of Italian colonial possessions occurred through post-war negotiations that confirmed what military defeat had already accomplished. Libya was placed under British and French administration before eventually becoming independent, while Italy's former East African territories were redistributed among Britain, France, and the newly restored Ethiopian Empire. The Italian settlers who had built lives and careers in these territories found themselves refugees in their own homeland, bearing witness to the complete collapse of imperial dreams. The economic cost of Italian imperial adventures became fully apparent only after the war, as analysts calculated the enormous resources that had been devoted to colonial expansion and warfare. The funds that had been spent on Ethiopian conquest and colonial administration could have financed massive infrastructure development within Italy itself, while the industrial capacity devoted to military production could have been used to modernize Italian agriculture and manufacturing. The opportunity cost of imperialism had been the failure to address the fundamental economic and social problems that had motivated imperial expansion in the first place. The human cost was even more devastating. Italian military casualties during World War II exceeded 400,000 killed and wounded, while civilian deaths from bombing, disease, and starvation added hundreds of thousands more to the toll. The destruction of Italian cities, industrial capacity, and transportation infrastructure represented decades of lost development and prosperity. Most tragically, the imperial adventures that were supposed to unite the Italian people and provide national purpose had instead divided the country and created lasting trauma that would influence Italian politics for generations. The psychological impact of imperial failure on Italian national consciousness was profound and lasting. The generation that had grown up with fascist propaganda about Italian greatness and imperial destiny found themselves confronting the reality of complete military defeat and the loss of national independence. The myths that had sustained Italian imperialism, racial superiority, historical destiny, military prowess, were revealed as dangerous fantasies that had led the nation to disaster. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Italian imperial collapse was its utter predictability. The fundamental contradictions between Italian ambitions and Italian capabilities had been apparent from the beginning of the colonial adventure in Eritrea. Every subsequent imperial venture had repeated the same pattern of initial optimism followed by logistical difficulties, unexpected resistance, and ultimate failure to achieve stated objectives. The Ethiopian conquest, which had seemed to break this pattern, had actually confirmed it by requiring resources that Italy could not sustain and creating commitments that Italy could not fulfill. The international isolation that resulted from Italian imperial aggression had made the country completely dependent on German support, while the resources devoted to colonial expansion had prevented the modernization of Italian military and industrial capabilities that might have made effective resistance possible. The empire that was supposed to make Italy a great power had instead made it a burden to its allies and a target for its enemies. In the ruins of Italian cities and the abandoned compounds of former colonies, the physical remnants of imperial ambition served as monuments to the gap between dreams and reality that had characterized Italian foreign policy since unification. The roads and railways built in Eritrea and Libya, the government buildings constructed in Addis Ababa, the monuments erected to celebrate colonial victories, all stood as testimony to the enormous human and material resources that had been devoted to imperial expansion that ultimately proved both unsustainable and counterproductive. The story of Italian imperialism thus ends not with triumph but with tragedy, not with the restoration of Roman greatness but with the near destruction of Italian independence. The empire that had been born from the romantic nationalism of the Risorgimento died in the rubble of World War II, leaving behind only memories of what might have been if Italian leaders had chosen development over expansion, cooperation over conquest, reality over dreams. In the gentle light of a Mediterranean sunset, falling across the 7 hills of Rome, where emperors had once ruled the known world, the last survivors of Italian imperial adventure could sometimes glimpse the magnitude of what had been lost and what had never really existed. They had been participants in one of history's most ambitious attempts to recreate ancient greatness through modern means, witnesses to the ultimate failure of will to overcome the constraints of geography, resources, and historical circumstance. Italy had wanted to be an empire, but remained a legend without substance, a dream that had consumed a nation's treasure and honor in pursuit of a greatness that had always been more imaginary than real. The lesson of Italian imperialism would echo through the decades that followed, that the price of imperial ambition, when divorced from practical capability, is measured not in distant colonies but in national survival itself. The Italian Empire was dead. Long live Italy, chastened, humbled, but finally free from the burden of impossible dreams.